Black Americans. Their history is one of forced migration, survival, cultural creation, and resilience against unimaginable violence. Millions of people were taken from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade and brought to the Americas. Families were separated, languages disappeared, entire ethnic identities were shattered. But where do Black Americans actually come from genetically? Are most descended from a single region of Africa? Or is the story far more complicated, shaped by centuries of migration, mixing, resistance, and survival across two continents? Scientists have wrestled with this question for decades, and now large-scale DNA studies are finally giving us answers. Some of them are genuinely surprising. In this video, we're going to trace the genetic story of Black Americans. From ancient West African civilizations and the transatlantic slave trade, through slavery and the Great Migration, all the way to modern DNA discoveries that are helping millions reconnect with lost ancestry. And along the way, we'll uncover why Black American DNA may preserve one of the most diverse genetic histories on Earth. Today, around 45 to 50 million Black Americans live across the United States, making them one of the largest African-descended populations outside the African continent itself. But their ancestry doesn't come from one place. It stretches across a massive geographic zone that includes present-day Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Angola, Congo, Sierra Leone, and many other regions. And geography shaped everything. West and Central Africa sit along ancient trade routes that connected forests, savannas, river systems, and coastlines for thousands of years. Long before Europeans arrived, people moved constantly across these regions through trade, migration, warfare, and empire building. That's not incidental. It's the reason Black American DNA is already deeply layered before the Atlantic slave trade even begins. Here's what's interesting. Black Americans created one of the most globally influential cultures in modern history. Music genres like jazz, blues, gospel, hip-hop, rock, and rhythm and blues all emerged largely from African American communities and went on to shape global culture. But beneath that cultural influence lies another story, one written in DNA. Scientists also noticed something medically important. Certain genetic traits associated with malaria resistance, including variants linked to sickle cell trait, appear more frequently in populations with ancestry from malaria-heavy regions of Africa. Those traits helped protect ancient populations against one of history's deadliest diseases, and some of those genetic patterns still appear in African-descended populations today. Language gives us another clue. Most Black Americans today speak English, but the deeper linguistic story points back to dozens, possibly hundreds, of African languages once spoken by enslaved ancestors. Many came from the Niger-Congo language family, one of the largest language families on Earth. It stretches across much of sub-Saharan Africa and includes languages like Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof, Akan, Kikongo, and Bantu, languages farther south. And this is where it gets surprising. Researchers found that certain speech patterns, rhythms, and even grammatical structures in African American vernacular English may preserve echoes of West African linguistic traditions. In places like the Gula Geechee communities of the southeastern United States, cultural and linguistic connections to West Africa remained especially strong because of relative geographic isolation. Some historians once assumed slavery completely erased African ethnic identity in the Americas, but fragments survived, in language, in music, in food, and eventually, scientists discovered, in DNA too. But before we get to the DNA, we need to go back much further to the people who were here first. The genetic roots of Black Americans begin in Africa, the birthplace of humanity itself. Modern humans evolved in Africa roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago before small groups eventually migrated outward into the rest of the world. For tens of thousands of years, African populations developed extraordinary genetic diversity. In fact, Africa contains more human genetic diversity than the rest of the world combined. That's a huge detail because it means African ancestry was never genetically uniform to begin with. After the last ice age, different populations across West and Central Africa developed distinct cultural and genetic identities tied to forests, grasslands, river systems, and trade networks. Hunter-gatherer groups survived in some regions, while farming communities expanded in others. Then came one of the most important migrations in African history. Beginning roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking populations expanded across much of sub-Saharan Africa. They carried agriculture, ironworking technology, and Niger-Congo languages into Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. Genetic studies show this migration reshaped huge portions of the continent while also mixing with earlier populations already living there. But West Africa remained incredibly diverse. Powerful states like the Mali Empire, Songhai Empire, Benin Kingdom, and Congo Kingdom connected millions of people through trade routes spanning the Sahara and Atlantic coast. Archaeological discoveries from places like Djenadjeno in Mali and Igbo Ukwu in Nigeria reveal advanced urban societies and long-distance trade networks centuries before European colonization. This matters because the people forced onto slave ships were not isolated tribes cut off from history. They came from sophisticated societies with deep regional diversity. Then came the catastrophe that transformed everything. Between the 1500s and 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas. Historians long knew the broad outlines of this system, but when scientists looked at DNA, they uncovered far more complexity than many expected. The history books often simplified Black American ancestry into a vague West African category. But genetic studies found ancestry from multiple specific African regions, often mixed together within the same family lines. Researchers from institutions including Harvard University, the University of Pennsylvania, and 23andMe analyzed large African American DNA datasets and found especially strong ancestry connections to present-day Nigeria, particularly Yoruba and Igbo populations, alongside ancestry from Senegal, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Angola, and Congo. And this is where it gets surprising. The DNA also revealed how slavery systematically disrupted African family structures. Enslaved people from different ethnic groups were intentionally mixed together on plantations to reduce rebellion and weaken communication. Over generations, entirely new African American identities formed in the United States. The history books said African ethnic identities vanished completely, but when scientists looked at the DNA, they found those ancestral connections still survived beneath centuries of separation. There was another painful layer, too. Most studies show that many Black Americans also carry European ancestry, often from the British Isles and other parts of Europe. Historians already knew sexual exploitation during slavery was widespread. DNA studies confirmed how deeply that violence shaped the genetic landscape of the United States. Researchers also found strong evidence of sex-biased ancestry patterns. In simple terms, European ancestry in African Americans disproportionately entered through male lines during slavery, while African maternal lineages remained especially strong. That pattern appears clearly in Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA studies. And yet, despite centuries of forced migration, violence, and cultural destruction, Black Americans preserved continuity in ways few people expected. That's not a small detail, because it means millions of descendants today can still trace connections back to specific African regions and populations, even after one of history's largest forced migrations tried to erase those links forever. Today, modern DNA studies show that Black American ancestry typically combines multiple West and Central African components, along with varying degrees of European ancestry and, in some cases, smaller indigenous American contributions. Average estimates vary by region and family history, but many studies suggest African Americans overall carry roughly 70 to 85% West and Central African ancestry,